Welcome back to the Victory Degree Podcast. Joining me today is Andy Holloway. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So, Andy, you are a co-host of the Fantasy Footballers podcast. And for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the podcast and what you guys do over in fantasy football land, it's a podcast that, during the NFL season, you guys upload 5 times a week. And your goal is to give your audience the best fantasy football advice on the planet. We joked around. I've been listening to you guys since funny story. I still remember I was in, what class was it? It might have been chemistry. I think I was in chemistry class and I was on my laptop and I was stressing out about a trade that one of my league mates had sent me. And at the time, you guys had this thing on your website where I think you could pay, maybe it was like $10, $15, and basically guarantee a response from one of either yourself, Jason Moore, who's a co-host of yours, or Mike Wright. And I had picked Jason at the time because Jason was my favorite. And sorry, but I think still to this day, he is my favorite.
That's all right.
And
a lot of people's favorite. Yeah.
And I remember I had sent him the trade and I was like, hey, Jason, what do you think? And I forget the exact trade. This was like 8 years ago, but I was like, hey, I'm getting this. What do you think? And he had given me advice. And funny enough, that year I won the championship. So Jason, if you end up listening to this, thank you for your advice.
I'll have to pass that along. It's good to know that it worked out that way. Those were early days when you could write in and send in any question.
Right. And I'm sure if you guys were to do something similar now, you'd probably be bombarded with simply too many questions and too many responses. You're consistently one of the top, if not the top, fantasy football podcast every year. Even beyond that, you're one of the top sports podcasts, consistently climbing the charts in the sports world. You've been going at this since February of 2015, so going on 9 years now, which I'm sure is crazy to think about for you.
Absolutely crazy, yeah.
But I, in doing research about you and about the podcast, your fantasy days started long before 20. Actually started in high school with a friend of yours named Jason Moore. And you guys were really into fantasy basketball. So tell me, and this might have been around the year 2000, 2001. So what was fantasy sports like back in those early days?
Yeah, that was high school. I was in a freshman Spanish class, and Jason is 2 years older than me, and somehow was in a freshman Spanish class. And so that's the only way that we ended up meeting, was he was this boisterous junior stuffed in the class with a bunch of quiet freshmen. And we ended up just sharing a friendship about basketball in general. Like, we played basketball together a lot in high school. And then fantasy sports at that time, we played on a platform called Sandbox, which, if you're not my age, you probably don't even remember. It predated a lot of the major platforms. And so we played fantasy basketball there and just fell in love with it. My first introduction to it was like seeing it in newspapers, and my uncle would play, but it was like, people had to call on the phone to report scores. I mean, you're talking early days, but Sandbox was an online platform. And so we kind of bonded over, the days of fantasy basketball and Dikembe Mutombo era fantasy basketball. And so it's funny because, like, you talked about being in class and having that question for Jason. Like, Jason and I's relationship has a couple of moments where, like, being in a class, that's how we met and started playing fantasy basketball. It's also, we were in the middle of real estate classes when we started the Fantasy Footballers podcast, which we didn't think was going to do what it did, and figured there's no way people make money doing this. So we're going to have to do something to make money. And so, yeah, it's a couple of classroom moments certainly catalyzed the journey.
Even before starting the Fantasy Footballers, you had joined a company with Jason. So Jason started the company, and then you and another guy by the name of Mike Wright joined this company. I believe you were the COO of that company with Jason. And you guys were working in the tech scene. You guys were involved with MySpace, which is even pre my time, to be honest. I mean, I had a couple of friends who had it, but I don't remember much about MySpace, to be honest with you. But I do remember Facebook games, and that's what you guys got into eventually with the company. So, if you remember Farmville, that was a big hit. And so you guys were doing a lot in the Facebook games kind of space. I'm curious, why leave tech and go pursue a podcast, especially back in 2015, where if you were to tell an average Joe on the street, hey, do you listen to podcasts? They'd be like, what is that?
Yeah, it's wild because I think I just saw a stat the other day about like 18 to 34-year-olds. There's a higher percentage of them that listen to a podcast regularly than even watch regular television now. So you're talking about a huge leap in consumption over 9 years. What's funny is in the both industries that I was a part of, both times I felt like we were late to that party. We thought we were late to the Facebook gaming party with the company that we were a part of, which is called Broken Bulb Studios, and we made Pokemon style game and city builders, and it was right in that heyday. But our distribution platform was Facebook, and so as acquisition changed and as advertising changed, our ability to acquire users changed. And so we had a startup that went from 30 plus employees to really struggling to make the transition into mobile gaming. And so when you ask why did we leave tech, it was kind of tech left us to a degree. The company had waned down from, I was there 8 years. As you said, I was the COO. I got started in tech doing front end graphic design and website design, CSS, that type of stuff. And, a lot of entrepreneurial side projects, just building sites for years in those early days of just trying to hustle your way to some sort of entrepreneurship. And so it just happened to be at the simultaneous moment where like the company started to shrink up and I knew I had to plan for the future. And we honestly, we had consumed podcasts in the fantasy football space for a long time, ESPN, CBS, the football guys, to name a few. And, we had long commutes to Scottsdale out here in Arizona. And so I'd listen to those shows all the time. I don't think we ever had a moment where we're like, hey, we can do it better. I think we had a moment where we said, hey, we just plain enjoy talking about fantasy. And we enjoy it so much. It was certainly a big part of the discussions at lunch tables during the tech days. And so it was like, we love this so much. People might enjoy kind of the camaraderie that the show was built around. And so, we just kind of spun that up. We really spun it up as a side thing for our league. And then Jason was listening to Mike and I and just said, hey, put that forward to the public. It'll be huge. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. There is no huge podcast in this space, but we were dedicated to doing it year round, which was new. And there were other hungry year round listeners, I think, that really helped us get off the ground floor.
I'm curious when you guys started the podcast, because I think in another podcast you had said how you always had a passion for entrepreneurship. You love building businesses from a young age as well. And so when you first started the podcast alongside Mike and Jason, did you view it as a business from the start, or was it just it was something that, like you were mentioning, you kind of viewed as a side gig and maybe it's fun, but I'm curious how seriously you took the podcast from the start.
Yeah, I mean, I think very seriously. I mean, that's something we really enjoy, especially Jason and myself, being kind of entrepreneurial at heart from the beginning. I mean, back in those high school days, literally my first like side gig or job I ever had was just being his like front end design guy for a web design business he had started. So like, we approached it as a business. We approached it using disciplines that we'd applied in other industries that we didn't think were being well applied in the podcasting space. Whether that was SEO to the degree that we were utilizing it, or maybe some of the social media engagement, certainly the year-round schedule, some of the video that we committed to early, even when it wasn't lucrative early, we knew where the world was headed in terms of video. So yeah, it was a business from day one. We needed to still see what that market meant, whether that was to be, a side type of business or whether that had the legs to become what it is today. And so that was going to be evaluated, but we knew that it had no shot of being either thing if we didn't put a lot of attention into it from day one. So yeah, we certainly approached it with the same kind of disciplines we felt like we knew and just wanted to see where it could go.
I'm curious, back to the early days, you start the podcast and I'm assuming you weren't monetizing right from the start. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you weren't monetizing from the start. And so what was that like in between phase like where you leave tech and you're now starting this podcast you're not making any money? And I ask because the advice that I see, besides the fact that I'm an aspiring podcaster, the advice that I see all over Twitter and other social media is hey, if you're going to start something, do it while you're working a 9 to 5. So you have some security and you have a safety blanket and you can pay the bills. And then eventually, once your side gig overtakes your 9 to 5 in terms of the amount of money that it's bringing in monthly, then it might be time to jump ship and go all in on this side project of yours. So all of that to say, early days, how did you view monetization and how stressful was it not making any money from the pod?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good point. I think that obviously that would be a luxury for a lot of people if they had the ability to do, put the amount of effort needed to grow a business while simultaneously having the security. It doesn't always work out that way. Certain industries, I think, require a level of sacrifice and commitment that just by nature takes more time, and so that can be difficult. That's why we had the misfortune slash fortune of kind of like seeing our current jobs disappear. But in those early days, we really had the mindset of buying months of survivability. And so, what you referred to at the very beginning of this podcast, how you knew Jason from the beginning, was asking him a question, doing paid question and answer. Like that was overwhelming for us to do. But at the time, it was it was something we were like, we got to manufacture a month's worth of revenue. We took our first podcast ad deal that we took from SeatGeek was negotiated on the basis of being paid up front. That is not traditional in podcasting. Normally what you do is you book ads and then, maybe there's a 60-day lag and then there's a 90-day or at least a 30-day time between invoicing. So you're talking 90 to 120 days from the time you might be doing ads to getting paid for it. So we knew that like that wasn't going to work for a football podcast that needed to manufacture income in the beginning. We made a deal that was very beneficial to the advertiser, but paid us up front. And we were willing to make that sacrifice to buy 2 months worth of existence, so to speak. And so, Patreon was something that was also a mechanism that, there goes one of my headphones. Patreon was a mechanism that we used because it was non-seasonal dependent. That was one of the questions we had in the beginning was, this is a football season that goes from August through December. We want to do it year round. How does that work? And so the monthly patronage and pledging and perks that come from, a stabilized monthly commitment from fans was something that helped steady the boat. So, you know, I guess my advice additional advice to the people that would say, you want to try to spin it up on the side. I totally agree. But once you get that moment or that inkling that you have something that has a much higher ceiling than where you're at, I think that's when we made the full-time commitment. Is we knew early, because of the market, we knew what football and fantasy football's market was in scale. Like I know a lot of people that are podcasters and they do a great job at podcasting, but that market of listenership is so small that there's no real way for me to make the logical leap from you get to do this thing that's your hobby and then turning that into monetization. Because there are people that are very passionate about, I don't know, knitting stuffed animals, probably, right? And you might be the best podcaster on the planet in that space, but your market is so small that the idea of monetizing it is very difficult, or could be more difficult. So once we had an inkling that this thing had a huge ceiling, which you know people have asked us for 9 years to do other podcasts and other sports. We have said no for 9 years because we still believe there's headroom in football. That's how big that market is. So it's really important to be realistic about what you're pursuing, I think, and whether that's just going to be a hobby or whether that's something that could be a full-time opportunity.
So that brings up an interesting point, because seemingly the advice, again, that you see on Twitter and other places is niche down. I always see people saying that all the time. It's like, all right, well, I know what it means, but I don't know if that's the right move for most people. Because to your point, you have to think about the total addressable market, right? I mean, exactly to what
Yes,
you said. If you're thinking about, starting a podcast on knitting stuffed animals, you might be the
right.
expert in that, but what's your TAM, right? It might be, might be 5 people, it might be 10, I'm not sure. But so, and I recently had this conversation with a friend where he was looking to start creating content, and I gave him the advice of starting broad. And I'm curious to get your take on that, and if you would agree generally with that principle of starting broad, and then through experience figuring out what you actually enjoy in a much larger market?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because obviously there are certain spaces and industries where you could monetize at a much greater level per person than other industries, right? If you're generating leads for a real estate professional or an insurance broker or somebody that whatever the case may be, you can be super niche if every customer represents a different value to you. It also, if you're not three guys starting a podcast and you're one, that's a difference in the amount of income you need to make. So all of those things factor in. I think I like the advice though in general, because I think if you look at that broad addressable market and then, that niche mentality can be in the way that you approach what you're doing within it. So, it doesn't have to necessarily be, you want to bring something unique to the table. You want to bring something that attracts people. And so I think to that degree, you're drilling. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like a broader market. Like, if you're in tires for vehicles, right? That's a humongous market. Everybody needs tires. Well, do you make the same tire that everybody else makes? Do you make a tire nobody's seen? Do you make something that a niche within that broader market finds attractive? Like, I think that there's a lot of ways to approach that. I don't think any of them will succeed if you don't have a passion for it. So if you tell somebody to go broad, but that broad topic ends up being something that bores them to death, they're not going to push through the very difficult beginning of the period of time. But um, I do think it's really important to be realistic and be able to mentally have a vision for what the end result will be. Like, even if it takes a lot of time, like, even if you have a belief in a certain niche and you're saying, hey, well, I can see in 18 months that if this many people are listening, it's going to turn into this type of a monetization strategy for me. Cool. But if you just don't know your market, you don't know how big it is, you don't have a plan for monetization, and you just podcast for 2 years, money doesn't show up in a basket on your doorstep. Like, that is not how it works. And I do think some people blindly go into the podcasting space just saying like, well, I want a podcast, so I'm going to have a podcast. Where's my money? And it takes a lot more granularity and strategy to succeed, I think.
So staying on the topic of strategy and of podcasts, seemingly everyone and their mom is starting a podcast nowadays, myself included. So I can't
How about your
hate
mom,
too much.
though? Does your mom have one?
My mom doesn't have one, although I will say if she did have one, I feel like it would be pretty good. And I think it'd be something with like nutrition. That's like one of her passions.
There you
She
go.
loves, whenever she buys food, she'll flip it around and look at all the calories and all the stats. So mom, if you're listening, I think you should give it a shot. Start that podcast.
There you go.
But so everyone's starting a podcast, and you talked about having a unique strategy, and you guys certainly had one. Like you said, at the time, there wasn't a year-round fantasy football podcast. Even having two other co-hosts, so a group of three of you guys on the podcast, was kind of new. Not too many people were doing it at the time either. So based off those two topics, what do you see currently going on with the podcast ecosystem? Do you see a lot of copycats? Do you see a lot of the same product? And then where do you think all of this is headed? Because my fear is that we get to a point where we get oversaturated with podcasts and people are pulled in 50 different directions, and they simply don't know what where to go for their information or who they like or what podcast they enjoy listening to. So 30,000 foot view, where do you see this whole podcasting thing going?
I mean, I think that the trajectory that it's headed is the one that matches the cliches that you kind of mentioned, where it's like everybody has a podcast. Well, I think it's getting top heavy in as much as like podcasting used to be indie, I think, for a long time. And now there's money in it. And so because there's money in it, then there's corporations in it. There's bigger names, whether it's like every celebrity has a podcast. I mean, I think that's another phrase that you could say. You've also got bigger advertising entities. In the beginning, Apple was the premier destination for podcast feeds. Now Spotify is a major, if not majority player. You have YouTube into podcasting, third-party providers, iHeartMedia, tons of big companies. And so because of that and because of the money coming into it, I think it is going to get top heavy. A lot more money is being spent to promote and build podcasts, obviously. And so that will make it, I think, more challenging for a startup to break through without existing relationships, capital to drive listenership. And that's not an easy, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion and I won't drill down into it. There aren't real practical ways, because it's the number one question I'll get for 9 years is, well, how do you get more listeners to your show? There aren't real granular, like I come from Google AdWords and Facebook advertising and, a lot of those media advertising world. And there's still not really a great way to go put a dollar in equal X amount of listenership. You can go spend on a press campaign, you can go spend on general awareness, but you can't really, not every listener is the same. Not every listener hangs around. You can't track follows in the granular way with advertising that you might want to be able to. And so, when you have a big celebrity that already has an audience, when you have a big platform that will promote you, like those are things that are going to be unfair advantages. And I think over the course of 9 years, I've realized the reality of that. Even if I've benefited from some of those relationships as we've grown, it's like, oh boy, I'm glad we didn't start it now a greater degree, just because I don't know if we break through the same way. I don't know if we have that organic growth if it's so saturated, like you said. So I think there's still room for tremendous innovation, but it's all about audience building and how committed they are to you as a personality. And I think that was one of our accidental secret sauces in the beginning. It was personality. It was, you said three hosts. It wasn't just being three hosts. It was three hosts in a room together. Like a lot of shows are on Zoom or remote, or a lot of major networks, have three guys that don't know each other. Like we were friends. We were in the same room. We had good audio quality, which incredibly people struggle with even today on podcasts, even though it costs almost a fraction of what it used to put just bare bones audio out there. That was kind of the linchpin of the connection. And when people are connected with you, podcasting is such a unique medium that it builds a relationship that's different than radio, TV, other markets. You have people that drive to work with you every day. You have people that do the gym every day, and they know you. And so if you're not building connection, I don't think you can build audience. And if you can't build audience, you can't monetize it. And so, that's kind of a lot of words to sum up an answer to your question, but that's kind of how I see it.
I think that last part you said is very powerful, because even me sitting here now interviewing you, I feel like I've known you for 9 years, and I feel like you're about to tell me to do a zero wide receiver strategy in my upcoming
Right.
draft.
Right. We noticed that when we did live shows, we noticed that like people, because afterwards we do meet and greets, and it was like all of a sudden all these people know who you. They come up like a friend. I've never talked to them in my life, but they're a friend because they hear every nuanced conversation we have on the show for 5 years.
Right. I think somebody said this somewhere, but they said that, podcasts are one of the hardest audiences to grow, but it's one of the more powerful ones. And something that you alluded to earlier, compared to maybe a YouTube audience or a Twitter audience or Instagram audience, that podcast audience, like you were saying, really, really gets to know you and views you as a friend. It's crazy how that happens. Cause like I said, even sitting here talking to you, I feel like I've known you for 9 years, but we've never met before doing this pod.
Right.
And here we are just talking. So it's pretty remarkable. Yeah. I wanted to go back to the early days and talk about, you had mentioned earlier in the podcast, looking for those early signals of, is this going to work? Are we on the right track? You guys were very lucky, like you mentioned, and seemingly hit the ground running. You uploaded your podcast and people fell in love with it right away. For many, let's say podcasters, let's just stay on kind of that genre, that is not the case. Again, like you mentioned, unless you're a celebrity who already has an audience, you don't really see those early signals right away. So I'm curious, what were you guys looking for as signals to say we're on the right track? And then what would your advice be for others who might not see that success right away, for what signals they should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because, I think we were very much paying attention to the metrics that we set up as audience growth. So we were literally in real estate class, refreshing download numbers, looking at week over week churn, were people staying around, looking at our social media engagement, looking at our reviews, listening to our own show on a regular basis and trying to, critique it and talk about it with one another. website traffic, SEO performance. I mean, those are all like a bunch of business metrics. Not a lot of those are just like subjective art metrics. And I think that's probably like a difference of approach for some podcasts. So we were looking at those things, and we felt like we were seeing growth in those areas to the degree that we believed the football season would prove it out. And we didn't have a guarantee that that would be the case, but we knew that our best opportunity to do that and to have success was going to be to put 100% of our time, effort, and attention into every new listener, which meant being very active in replying on social media or engaging with people and being as creative as we could to build community. And so, yeah, I mean, if I'm a new podcaster asking that question, I think it's hard. I think it's really hard. You need to step outside yourself to whatever degree I think that you can, especially if you're a solo podcaster. I would try to be as trying to find the right word for it, but like self-aware as possible in terms of getting feedback from friends, family, maybe not either of those, maybe just like as much true, real feedback as you can get. If I was in a certain other niche, I'd certainly try to do my due diligence on speaking to the successful people within that section of podcasting, because I'd want to know what success represents. And if I don't have an idea of that when I start, like it's not, you can't just talk and everyone comes and listens to you, right? Like there's a lot more evaluation in that process. So, but yeah, I mean, I go to metrics at the end of the day. Like, it's funny because I'll listen to like financial talk shows sometimes, and maybe there's a parallel here, but I'll listen to shows and I'll hear somebody say, well, I started a business doing woodworking, and I've done it for 18 months. And then you're like, okay, well, what were your profits last year? It's like, well, I lost $10,000. Okay, well, what are the numbers telling you about what you're doing, right? Like, you might love woodworking, but if you lost $10,000 on the year, like, you don't have a business. You have a hobby. You have something that you enjoy doing, but let's put it in a different category. Like, there's nothing wrong with doing a podcast for $0. If you enjoy doing it and you have 500 people that listen to you or 200 people that listen to you, and you enjoy bringing something of value to them, that's something you can be proud of. And you don't have to evaluate it by the metric of financial success. But, if you're looking for signals of success and you want to monetize it, you have to look at some of those metrics. So, I have friends that have done a podcast and it's taken them 3 years to get traction. Now they have a little bit of traction now, but they had to push through 3 years of like probably 6 different times saying we should probably quit. And they did. They didn't quit, and they have a little more traction and more success. But it's hard. It's a hard nut to crack sometimes.
Yeah, it almost brings up an interesting dilemma, because there's the advice of pushing through the pain, like your friend did, and sticking with something. But then there's also the advice of look for signals to say that you're on the right track. And if you were to go back to your friend and say, hey, in year 2, when you still didn't see any signals and you still weren't gaining any traction, and you still maybe had 200 listeners, maybe your listener number was flat for a couple of years, it brings up this dilemma of, do you keep going or do you say this isn't for me? So I don't know. It's something that I always think about, because this podcast is something that I enjoy doing. And I love talking to people like yourself. And so I know I'm going to keep at this for a while and push through the pain and those down days. But it's just an interesting dilemma of, do you keep going or do you stop and try something new? And it seems like people give up too easily.
Sometimes they do, and sometimes they give up too late. I mean, so you're talking both sides of the equation. So the reality that I think will help an individual determine that is not aimlessly moving forward with what you're doing. And this is good for life advice in general. Like, write on a piece of paper, if you have to, what you believe success is defined as. And not just like, I'm doing a podcast and people like it. Like, if that's all that matters, put that on the paper. But if it's, I've got this many people listening after 6 months, and that's kind of my line in the sand, maybe that is a way to say, hey, I achieved my goal, and I haven't achieved my goal, and it's not proportionally valuable for my time anymore. During that period of time when our friends were having a lack of success, one of the solutions that they had to put into practice was like, how do we want to push through, but it's taking up too much time. So how do we balance that? How do we take away the, 80% of ineffective things we're doing and focus on the 20% of effective things we're doing? And then we'll grind on those 20%. So That's an important thing too, where you kind of carve away the waste, and if you want to push through and just do effective things, and maybe it takes up less time. So, you know, not having an outcome that that you want or a way to measure is just, to me, that's just becomes kind of aimless. But if you can do that, and you get to that point and you say, hey, I'm not where I need to be, hang it up, go do something else. You got 1,000 things you could do. If it's where you're at, you're like, hey, I've made some progress, and then that gives you more encouragement to keep driving on.
I want to switch to the topic of staying focused, and you had brought this up where you've had opportunities to do other fantasy sports, but you guys have stuck with fantasy football. And let's say, again, sticking with podcasters, let's say your podcast is gaining traction, you're getting more opportunities, people are reaching out. Hey, Andy, wouldn't it be cool if you did a newsletter? Hey, Andy, wouldn't it be cool if you did, fantasy basketball? Hey, Andy, how about this? How about that? But seemingly staying focused is the advice that I always hear from others. And you guys, despite now doing live shows and despite doing other things, it seems like you have always kept your focus on the podcast. So talk to me a little bit about the importance of staying focused and how that's helped you in building your podcast.
Yeah, I think it's the most important business advice I could give anybody ever. I think people are somehow blinded by this illusion that they can do everything all at once and do it well. We all have the same amount of hours in the day, every one of us, and we can apply those hours to the things that we believe are most effective and benefit our business the most. We have lived every minute of our business under that 80/20 principle, where, 80% of the effect comes from 20% of the causes. The idea that we just are going to stay focused. We're not going to grade success of your business by the amount of things you're doing, which sounds like a crazy thing to have to say out loud. But for some reason in our culture and in the business world, there's some kind of distorted view of doing a few things well and doing them well over time. And because you're not adding some sort of outwardly focused change to the equation, you're not succeeding. I think that is an illusion. I think that causes people to lose focus and not know what their business is about or what it could be. And so some of our biggest decisions as a business have been to say no or no, not yet. Both of those things have been huge for us, whether it was building product that we delayed because we wanted it to be of a certain quality, whether it was opportunities that outwardly people would have said, that's amazing that you're doing that. Well, okay, but what does it tangibly mean for my family, my business partners, my employees? One thing that was very comedic to all of us is that we had been doing this podcast, and I would say for the first 4 or 5 years, every time somebody asks you what you do for a living, if you mention podcasts, they're just like confused out of their mind, and they all say, "How do you make money doing it?" This is not a real job. It is not a real industry. I don't get that anymore because I think it's enough in the language of our world to understand that there are the Joe Rogans and these bigger shows. So there's some understanding of it. But one of the funniest things that happened to us is that when we had the opportunity to do, I think we did it for 2 years. We did a live show on SiriusXM. Now, SiriusXM, we did the show. It was fine. It wasn't like we didn't do the show to make a bunch of money, and we had the opportunity to do a once a week live thing. But the reaction of the public when we got that show was, "You've made it," making it because it was more well known. Like satellite radio was more understood than podcasting. So I've said this for 9 years. I'd rather be the quieter, growing, successful business than the distracted, boisterous, we're doing a million things but we're going nowhere type of situation. If that makes
And
sense.
no, it does. And you have a unique case as well because you have two other business partners, two other co-hosts. And so how difficult is it to keep all three of you focused on the same goal and the path that you guys are all taking together?
It's the biggest blessing that we have as a company was the fact that we're very united in that regard of what our objectives are. So, part of that came from having a very clear shared vision in the beginning, and also being three men that were in the exact same stage of life. We all had three children, We're all similar ages. We all live in the same place. We all had fairly similar worldviews of what we deem important and what we think is valuable. And because of that, that is something where we have been 99.9% united. And I've been a part of businesses where there's been complete divide at the top of companies that have caused partners to leave and, partners to be, have huge falling outs. So we try to stay on guard for that type of thing. And thankfully, we've had the same view of where to go and what to do. But we also really we had to be really intentional about that in the beginning. And we've had to be really intentional about it every single year because it's so easy to lose sight of your purpose. We have a little vinyl sign above our window in our office, which we share like in a larger office, the three of us in our studio. And it says, remember why you do this and remember how you got here. And we put that up when it made no sense to put it up. It was like like an attack for the future. It was like, putting it out there because we knew if someday we have success, we're going to need to look at that. And it's still difficult. So, it's one of those things where I think intentionality is huge. You can't just be aimless.
Any, I don't know if you want to, air dirty laundry, but any arguments or anything like that you've gone into with Mike or Jason, either with the podcast or where the business is going? I have to ask because after watching you guys for 9 years. Yeah.
And I would be more than happy to throw those two knuckleheads under the bus. But the comedy of the whole situation is that those are two great men that I work with that are not like, we talk about things and we're very honest about things, but thankfully we haven't had those big arguments and those big controversies. We work through any difficulties we have. Our biggest fights, I'm telling you the truth, the biggest fight I ever had with Jason in the office was contrasting opinions on Brandon Ayuk 2 years ago. It wasn't a big business fight that caused us to be silent in the silent treatment in the office. It was disagreeing opinions on a fantasy player. And we were so mad at each other that we didn't talk until the show started one time. Like, that is a huge blessing to work with people like that. I think we've taken this approach too, where, it's not like we're the exact same mind that has the exact same goal for every single thing. It's just that if one person, or, a lot of the times with three people, majority rules to a degree. But if it's a sensitive area, we just go with the lowest common opinion. Like, if two of us are like, I'd love to do this, show, and one person's like, I'm kind of uncomfortable on that topic or something, like, we're going to go with the guy, we're going to have the sensitivity to go with the guy that's like not comfortable and just move on. Like, we don't want to drag anybody along in the business. And so, I wish I could tell you about a bunch of hilarious, stories like that, but really it's been fantasy arguments and that's it.
I was going to guess Kerryon Johnson might have been, might have been one of those arguments.
Yeah. Look, everybody gets under each other's skin from time to time, but we care about each other. We've been friends for 20 something years. We know how each other think about things. And so it's been a huge advantage. And, at the same time, we also learned from watching the inverse happen at previous businesses where, that lack of shared vision really damaged the employees and the business and everything. So we had the benefit of a little bit of hindsight of watching that.
You mentioned the sign that says, remember why you're doing this. And I'm curious for you specifically, what is your why? And then does that somehow tie into what you view your responsibilities as, co-host of the Fantasy Footballers podcast?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of whys. I think predominantly we want to and have always wanted to be a positive impact in a space that needed it, in my opinion. We joke that we're the Disney of fantasy football to some degree. We viewed some of the sports betting and fantasy football world was basement dwelling, meathead, no family involvement. I'm going to go hide in the basement. Like, that attitude around it. And we felt like it was something that was more accessible, something that we wanted to provide that dad could listen in the car at the same time he's taking the kids to school. So I think that was a little bit different in the space. But look, I get a tremendous amount of joy of building a business that we have creative control over for the sake of providing for our families and for our employees, and doing it in a proportionality to our real lives that we think is, lets us enjoy our day-to-day existence. Like, our families are very important to us. The way we build out our company and the employees are very important to us. And like, to me, there's no greater gift in life than being able to do something you love, provide for people you love, and be a positive impact in a public way. So, to me, that's my why. Anything that betrays that becomes a conversation that we have to have and becomes one of those no or no, not yets or something to that degree. But I think that rules the day for us on the whole.
I'm curious how you view podcasting, from a business perspective. And what I mean by that is, with a typical business, there's usually an exit strategy, right? You build up a business. Let's say your goal is to sell the business. You do that, you cash out, and then you go do whatever you want with your life. That's what some entrepreneurs do. With podcasting, it's difficult because it's not like you can necessarily sell me the fantasy footballers, and then I step in with two of my buddies, and all of a sudden,
Yeah,
we're the new
we've
Andy,
talked
Mike, and
about that.
Jason. So like,
Yeah,
what?
we come with the deal, right?
Right. So like, what's the end goal with the business? Like, is this just something that you're going to ride into the sunset with, or what?
Yeah,
I
I mean,
guess
I
that's
think no, it's a good question. I get what you're saying. We've been asked that before, acquisition, things like that. I think everybody's made to work, and so I think that's a redeemable, enjoyable part of life is to be productive and to do something that adds to the world. And I think that's, I'm probably more on the side of, retirement's a bit of an illusion because I know a lot of people that retire and they're miserable because they don't feel like they bring purpose to the world. So, whether that means I do it till I'm 70, I doubt that happens. But, we have children, that I'd love to, they have interest, get involved in the space. We also build the business in a way that we hope has enough, the stool has enough legs, where we have a website and products and we have a brand and we have apps and we have things that aren't just us talking into a microphone that hopefully can outlive, if one of us hits the wall at some point in time. But, we kind of joke that like if someone offered us $1 billion for the company tomorrow and let us walk away, where do I drive the next morning? Right? Like I probably want to drive to a building with my friends and do what we do. So in that regard, I want to enjoy what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. And if that starts to change, then maybe we have a different end goal. I don't know what 20 years from now holds, but right now we like what we're doing. It's very rewarding to provide for our employees that are amazing people. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. And we'll take opportunities as they come.
It's like that one story of the Mexican fisherman who fishes all day, enjoys his days, loves to fish. And a business guy from Chicago comes down to Mexico on vacation, and he sees the fisherman, and he says to the fisherman, why are you only catching 2 or 3 fish a day? You could be catching 50 fish, 100 fish, and then you could sell it, and then you could start a business, and then you can outsource to different countries and do this and do that. And
Yeah.
the Mexican fisherman says, well, why would I want to do that? And the business guy says, well, so you can make a lot of money. And then the fisherman says, and then what? And then, and then you retire and you can do whatever you want. He's like, oh, okay. So then I would just end up fishing all day. So
right. No, that's a really that's a good story and a really good analogy to how I feel about it. Like, you know, this what was it? Rockefeller said something like, "How much money do you need?" And he said, "Oh, a little bit more." You could have this like, when do you find contentment and joy? To me, it doesn't come from money. It doesn't come from ease. So because those aren't the highest goals for us as individuals, like makes it easier to be content, which is I think like a secretly faux pas word in America and in business. But like, what if we were content in our day to day? And what if we enjoyed our families? And what if we enjoyed fishing?
right. So let's go to that day to day, because I'm sure fans of the pod would love to know what a typical day in the life looks like for Andy Holloway. And I'll say this as well. You had tweeted once that you attribute the popularity of your podcast, of the Fantasy Footballers podcast, to humor, production value, and accurate football information based on extensive research. So question one, what does a typical day to day, typical day in the life look like for Andy Holloway? And then question two will be, what does that extensive football research look like?
Those are good questions. And it's a bit of a trick question because we are a seasonal podcast. So to that degree, we have for those that don't know, like we record 5 shows a week from August through December. And that's kind of a lie as well, because we record a Dynasty show, we record a Spitballers episode, we record a Footcast, which is premium content for our listenership. So we do about 8 shows. And so the regular season, it very much carries a standard day-to-day routine. We record at 8 in the morning, we post-produce, get that out, we work on the show doc for the next day, depending if there's games or another recording for that day. Like the season is very much, to some degree, the season is comfortable in the sense that every day is the same routine and you get to enjoy, like the content's produced for you by the NFL and then you get to respond to it. What makes the time that's a lot different is the off season, where we record 2 shows a week from January through June. And that's very much our tech development cycle. So when you talk about kind of leaving tech, we got to preserve that portion of it where, the off season, we're recording 2 shows a week. That's also when we do our like statistical projections and player analysis. We do all of our college film work. We do a lot of our business planning. We do our app development, UDK improvements. We're surveying the Foot Clan for things that we can improve from their experience, making changes to our processes internally, which means employees. And so we do get a period of time during the off season that our day to day is very different from one period of time to the other. It's also when we do more of our traveling. In a couple of weeks, we'll go out to LA and meet with some different companies in terms of next steps for maybe the podcast or for video. And so I do enjoy the fact that there's a very different time of year and a different experience, because we could not survive like 30 weeks of football. Like 18 of them is like plenty. But yeah, on a day-to-day basis, we've been blessed with like some really incredible human beings. Kyle Borgononi is like our head of content in terms of like show doc preparation and research. So we'll meet regularly with him and go over things that we want to include in our shows. But as the company has added really smart personnel, our jobs have changed, and it lets us focus on the things we love doing. Which might be scouting during this time of year, building out our player projections. There's tons of different resources we utilize for that. I mean, a lot of them are public, common, research, Pro Football Reference and PFF, and probably about 10 others that we have subscriptions to. But yeah, there's an ebb and flow to the years now that is pretty fun, and I really enjoy this time of year. I enjoy building the business side of things and building the products, and then getting to debut them for the season.
I think it's fair to say that in many people's eyes.
Oh, and pickleball. We play some pickleball too.
Oh,
Sorry.
There you go. Yeah, I saw that you have a love for pickleball, and it's on the rise.
We're old now.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, tennis is still better, but pickleball is definitely making its way.
You're not gonna be able to find a place to play tennis soon, though. That's the problem.
Yeah, well, that's what's getting me worried about these pickleball enthusiasts, is they're taking over, and I don't like it.
They are. I know. That's all the tennis players have a real angst about that.
Yeah. Andy, in many people's eyes, you alongside Mike and Jason have what many would consider, including myself, a dream job. You get to talk about football, you get to research players, you get to watch all of the games. I'm sure if you were to ask, anybody in high school or maybe middle school, hey, what's your dream job? I wish I could just watch sports all day. That I guarantee you that would be that was at least that would have been my answer back in high school. I wish I could just watch sports all day. Right. So for many, you have a dream job. I'm curious, though, any downsides to your job that maybe people don't realize, or any things that maybe you don't really love doing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any profound complaints about the situation that we're in and the fact that we get to do what we do, and we really try to keep perspective on that. But anything you do that was like a hobby and a passion, that becomes a job where you're responsible for people, where the fisherman can go out and fish and catch 2 fish and go home. And if you tell him he's got to stay there for 10 hours no matter what every day and then go home, maybe it's not as much of a pleasure. So there have been some things in terms of maybe individual passion for fantasy football that have changed over the years, just with doing the grind for 8 or 9 seasons, but not to a degree that it's a real complaint, just that it changes the nature of something that was a hobby. And anytime it's a business, that changes some of the dynamic there. And, every business has to deal with, business things, whether it's financial or interpersonal and employee and, decision making and integrating different personalities into leadership and making decisions around partnerships and brands you represent. And not that those things are necessarily burdensome, but they're also consequential, right? Like, and so they take up your brain. And I am a very like type A responsibility firstborn man. And like, so I take it very seriously, like what we do and how it provides for our employees. And so there's a weight to that you don't get if I was just clocking in and out of a job somewhere else. Like, I think there's a bunch of cliches about how overrated entrepreneurship can be in the sense that you kind of are working 24/7, at least mentally. And so some of those things might be considered downsides. But again, I don't want to overplay them because I know how blessed we are. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to get to do what we do. And definitely don't take it for granted.
Couple more questions to round us out here. Being in the limelight and being a public figure comes with a lot of pros, but certainly a lot of cons. And I'm curious, especially being in the niche that you are with fantasy football and giving your opinion day in and day out and telling people to draft this player and knowing how competitive fantasy football players are, including myself, we oftentimes get angry at an Andy Holloway or Jason Moore or a Mike Wright when they give us the wrong pick for that week and we lose our fantasy matchup and we think, man, if only I didn't listen to Andy. And then I go to Twitter and I at you on Twitter and I say, Andy, you are the worst fantasy football analyst ever. You suck. I'm never listening to the podcast again. How does Andy Holloway deal with comments like that?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I feel like we have maybe we've had the benefit of less of that than I thought we would get. Not that we don't get it. It's just that I feel like for whatever reason, maybe it's because there's 3 opinions on the show, maybe because our audience and the listeners are far more reasonable Twitter followers. I don't know. I feel like we've been surprised at times that we don't deal with more of that because obviously you're on Twitter, you witness the trolls and the amount of feedback and things like that. Like there's definitely been the conversations in studio of like, please don't read the YouTube comments, or like don't pay attention to the YouTube comments, those type of things. There's a mute button, right? There's a mute button on Twitter, and I think influence like that it's been interesting. I think social media in general is like this strangely important, dangerous, informative, terrible, necessary, wish we didn't have it thing. It's all of those, right? Like it's my job, and the amount of times that I have I'll break this out. I've said this before because it's fairly new, but like I have a phone that I keep at the office that has our social media on it, and I do not bring that home. Like I have Twitter on my home phone, but I don't have Instagram and TikTok and other platforms. I need like access to them because it's our business. We put content out on them and we build our business with them. But I don't want to be consumed by that, right? Like, and so that's such a tough balance because every business needs to have success in social media in order to build their business. And yet it's like has the potential to make you crazy if you pay too much attention to it. So I think in the most part, like I lay my head on my pillow with contentment if I'm doing the best at what I can do. And, hopefully the majority of people out there understand we're doing the best we can do with an unpredictable, can't see the future space. And it seems like most people are pretty forgiving of that reality. Like we try to get more right than we get wrong. We put in the time and effort that is, I think, worthy of the opinion. And then you let the chips fall. Like we don't control any of that. And so we want you to have the best time ever playing fantasy football. And we understand that winning is a part of that, but it's not exclusive, right? 1 in 12 people win every year. 11 other people play in your league, and we want you to enjoy the journey and the ride. And we lose and we have heartbreak and we get mad at ourselves for a decision, and we watch TV differently. Like you talk about a downside to the show. I should have brought that up. When we watched the TVs on Sunday morning, it went from rooting for my guy to rooting for my opinion to sometimes because we want to come through for people. Like, I want my guy to produce like Mike Evans, not like, somebody that failed the year before. And so you have a different way of watching football where it's like, man, I want my team to win, but like also I would like the people I recommended this week to lead our listenership to success so that they had a good week. Like So it does change the way you watch TV and stuff like that. I think the majority of the time we drown out the noise. We try to be self-aware, like I said earlier. Like you don't want to like not listen to anybody's feedback ever, but at the same time, like whose feedback matters the most, right? And so try to pay attention to those voices, let the other ones be quiet, and move forward.
Yeah, it reminds me of this quote from Nick Kyrgios, tennis player, now turned tennis
I know.
commentator. But
I've seen a lot of his very emotional highlights.
good way to put it. Yeah, quite the act on the court. But honestly, and it's, one of those things, don't judge a book by its cover, because I've listened to a couple podcast interviews with him. I suggest you go check him out, only because he ended up being someone who was way more insightful than I had originally thought. Again, just judging based off his tennis game. But he talks about the difficulty of being a tennis player and the expectations and all of this stuff. And he talks about how if you really want to critique someone, only be willing to critique someone if you're willing to step into their shoes for a day. And that kind of hit home for me, because even listening to you talk about rooting for your opinion and, rooting for, your guys to perform well, I don't really understand the burden that you have to go through. And so for me to sit here and say, well, Andy really screwed the pooch last week and I lost my fantasy matchup, or, Andy's job is so easy, or, I could say any one of those things, but I don't really truly understand your situation unless I were to step into your shoes and really understand what it's like to be Andy Holloway. So that hit home, because you don't really realize what people are going through unless you're willing to understand what they're going through. And so I don't have the burden of waking up Monday morning knowing that somebody, a fantasy player that I had recommended that past week to my listeners just failed, maybe got a goose egg, did nothing.
Sure.
So it's just an interesting perspective that I think applies to your situation as well.
And it really happens in sports a lot, because as fans, when people are put up in public view, like you don't, you're like, oh my gosh, that guy should have done this or that. Like you don't know that they moved across the country with their family after they got traded, and so that was like a big, transition for them, or what injuries they're dealing with, or like, what DMs they got that day. Like, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. Like I'll go for the one-liner on Twitter to talk about some player because it's funny. But like deep down, I know like that's like a pretty insincere thing to say, because you don't understand. And we've had the opportunity to talk to a handful of players that help illuminate that for us. But yeah, I mean, anytime, we're not like slow to speak on social media, right? And so that's probably a good thing to practice.
Andy, I have to ask you, a big part of your life is being a father and having a family. And I'm curious, from the perspective of a father, what has fatherhood taught you about business or life that you previously didn't know?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think fatherhood in general forces you to recognize areas of your life where you're selfish. I mean, I think marriage does that first, and then like, having children does that as well. Like it's a pruning away of self, whether you want to or not. And so it teaches you areas of your life where you hold a firm grip over control when you don't have control. It certainly taught me to give up control in a lot of ways, and to understand that I can't influence every decision my kid makes, or make everything go perfectly for them, right? Like you see ups and downs that people have to go through and kids have to go through. And so I think that that's kind of the most profound personal impact that like having children had on my life, was just, something greater than you that, illustrates areas of your life where you are internally focused and probably needs to change. So, different degrees of empathy and understanding as a father, in business, it's a cop out, but I mean, it reprioritizes what you find valuable. And I'm a person that, in the hierarchy of what's important, I think things function best when they're in the right place. So if I put something in the wrong order, it doesn't mean that it's better. For instance, if I put my business above my family, I don't think I get a better result in business by doing that, because I don't think business belongs there. I think business has its right shaped spot where it belongs in the hierarchy of life. And I think it functions best and has most success there. So, being a dad and prioritizing that imperfectly, might I add, very imperfectly, but having that hierarchy, I think, allows things to function in the natural way that they're meant to be. So, you know, that would be my kind of bigger answer to the question.
I think I remember you talking about your oldest son and how he has gone into fantasy football. And I think maybe on a podcast that you were on a couple years ago, you talked about him running around in a Mahomes jersey and being a huge Mahomes fan. I mean, what does that mean to you, seeing your kids develop the same passion that you have for football? We can get past the whole
Well,
Mahomes thing because I'm a 49ers fan, so
yeah, he's already
I won't
moved
hold it
on,
against him. Okay, well, good,
He's moved on
good.
already because he's just different fantasy players. But it's actually my middle son, so that'll bring
Mm.
up a good conversation there because my older son just never really took to it, and it wasn't something I was going to force on them. It was just like the middle son just had a more of an acumen for stats and numbers, and like he'd be the one sitting down on the couch and going crazy over a play or watching sports with me. So it just shows that, like, my two boys, same parents, a couple years apart, totally different personalities, totally different things that make them tick, and got different parts of their mom and I. And it's certainly a cool thing to get to share something that I really enjoy. But at the same time, the time I spend with the son that has no interest in it is just as wonderful to me because it's a break from this thing that's my job. So, it just, we all have like kids that are similar ages to other hosts and myself. And some of them are like into that, and some of them are just like, would rather have nothing to do with it. It's kind of unique.
Last question, and then we'll end it with a little thing that we do on every episode here at the Victory Degree podcast. Last question is, being around as many athletes as you are, either watching them through the TV, researching their stats, even interviewing a couple of them as guests on your show, I'm curious what you've taken away from them in terms of advice on, how to live better or how to perform better in business. I'm curious what athletes have taught you.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think I'll probably give a roundabout answer to this, which is just that having done this for a while and now having, we started the podcast and there are players that have had entire careers, but begin and end before where we're at now. I think I think it's been illustrative of like maybe how temporary that window is and how fleeting and quick that can go for a lot of players. Like, and just realizing the amount of time, effort, work, grit, fight, good fortune a lot of the time comes together to give this very small window where these players are put on a pedestal where they're part of fantasy football, where they make a lot of money, but then they're like, we've seen several of them have to transition to post career. We were friends with David Johnson of the Arizona Cardinals, who had an incredible career here in Arizona, but at the same time, like, it's a pretty brief run as a running back in the NFL, and seeing him go through the process of kind of now out of the league, and players like Austin Eckler come on the show and they're building out other parts of their brand so that they have something, that they're building out for after playing. So I guess it's been neat to see players kind of come alive to the fact that they have direct influence now with social media to build their own following, to build that audience. Because of fantasy and sports betting, fans are now fans of specific players. Like my son put on a Mahomes jersey and ran around because he was his quarterback in his fantasy team, not because we live in Kansas City. And same with Eckler. Like my son fell in love with him because of 1 year. So you are fans of players now, and players have the opportunity to kind of relay that into post career stuff. So it's been interesting to watch
I lied to you. I have one more question, and I just remembered because you were talking
that.
about the role of fortune. How important do you think luck and timing and things that you can't necessarily measure in the moment, how important do you think those things are to success? And I ask that because I think people avoid those topics because of the fact that you can't really measure it, and it seems like an unfair advantage. You can to some extent measure hard work. How many hours are you working? You can measure,
Yep.
am I doing the right things? Am I distributing to the right platforms? All of that stuff. But luck and timing seem like they can't really be measured. So I'm curious, what do you think? How important are they to eventual success?
It's a great question. I think it spans every job and situation in the world if you really wanted to broaden it out. I think after 9 years of doing this, I would say they affect more than I thought when I got into the space, and not enough to dissuade somebody from working hard at something. So that's my answer to that question. I mean, I think I've always, I'm a stats guy, right? So I paid attention to baseball a lot growing up, and I always thought about the left-handed hitter that ended up on a team with a short right field porch, and or the superstar athlete that got there's even a better hitter behind him, so he gets to hit in front of him every week. And like, there's tons of coaches that, and players that got opportunities in one town that they never would have gotten somewhere else. So, because we don't control it, I think it's easy to beg the question of like, well, what influence does that have? If you don't control it, then you can't, the old cliche, make your own luck. Like, I mean, goodness, like there's some things you can't do that on, right? And I didn't control meeting a certain person that came to work for us. That just happens. And so I think being thankful for those things is certainly a good start, because I think there's a temptation for some people to pretend they did control every one of them, right? And with that comes like an arrogance that's probably not very productive for a business. So, sometimes you got to be thankful for good fortune, good timing, good circumstances, good people, and you control none of them. And you just have to say, hey, I'm so thankful for that. I'm going to take advantage of that. Like I'll make the most of that, right? Like when it does come your way, if you're not prepared, then it ain't lucky, right? Like if you're not ready to take advantage of it, then that's the part you do control. So yeah, I do think it plays a role, but it's unpredictable.
I think of
And
Brock Purdy.
let me add one thing real quick,
Mm-hmm.
which is just that when you're young, you don't get the benefit of hindsight. So you don't know how bad things become good and good things become bad. And that can be a real trip on somebody that's 19, 20, 21 trying to do business. I have the benefit now at my age, my ridiculously older than it should be age, to know that like I'm thankful for that other business failing, right? Like it collapsed. So like let's not, focus so much on the moment and not see how it can turn into something better. Like if our other business doesn't collapse, I'm not doing this. So just because you started a dream or you had a dream for something, if it doesn't work out in the way you saw it, that doesn't mean that wasn't the best thing that's ever happened to you because of the next thing down the road. And you don't get to have hindsight when you're young, but you do when you're older, and you can tell people.
That's a great point. I think of Brock Purdy, and I think his example, I have to bring him up as a Niners fan,
Gosh,
but
yeah.
I think his example ties in what you just said beautifully. I mean, here's a guy got drafted last pick of the draft, came into a Niners organization who seemingly had their quarterback of the future in Trey Lance, but also had, a vet who's taken them to the Super Bowl in Jimmy Garoppolo. And it took injuries to both of those guys for Purdy to even get a shot at playing quarterback. And I still remember and will never forget how I felt watching that Dolphins game when Garoppolo went down and seeing him getting carted off. And I was like, there goes our season. That's it. And little did I know that this kid Purdy would step in and do what he did. So, I mean, just thinking of his example is, you talk about a guy who stayed prepared and had, some luck go his way, but maximize his opportunity.
That's all you can do. You can control maximizing the opportunity. I'm sure when he got drafted there, he might have thought, there's like 2 starters ahead of me that are going to mean my career is wasted here. I should have gone somewhere else. So you don't see everything. Pretending you can doesn't help you. So yeah, that's a good example.
Andy, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed every single bit of it. Bit of a full circle moment for me. Like I said, having watching guys for 9 years and feeling like I'm best friends with you, but now actually getting, a chance to sit down with you and ask you all these questions. Certainly a full circle moment that I am very grateful for. But before I let you go, we do have to do one more thing, and it's a little thing that we do on every episode of the Victory Degree podcast. I ask each of my guests to leave a piece of advice for our next guest, but the catch is that you do not know who the next guest is going to be. So our previous guest was an author by the name of Mike Silsky. Mike wrote a fantastic book called The Rise, Kobe Bryant and the Pursuit of Immortality. I read it in probably 2 days because it was that good. And this is in no way, sponsored or anything like that. These are true thoughts. Basically talks about Kobe Bryant's rise and his early days, both in Italy, in high school. A lot of people, I think know Kobe Bryant and who he was when he was on the Lakers and all those years. But I think few people knew Kobe as a high schooler and as a kid growing up, and what his parents were like, and the fact that his dad Joe was an amazing basketball talent, but never had the mentality to make it, make a long career out of it in the NBA. So fantastic read, highly recommend. His advice to you, I thought this was amazing. His advice was keep a running list of the 10 best days of your life. This list will give you a good guidepost to what matters and who you are becoming as a person. So first of all, what does that advice mean to you? And then what is the piece of advice you'd like to leave for our next guest?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice. Perspective is manufacturing ways to maintain perspective, I think, is incredibly important. And we have short memories sometimes, right? Sometimes we just remember negatives and we struggle to remember the great things, you know. We always tell our daughter, you know, you're not allowed to use the words always and never, because when we're in the middle of arguments, she'll just be like, you're always mean to me. And we're like, okay, no, we're not. You never let me have a treat. Okay, you had a treat 2 days ago. But the perspective of a 9-year-old is like, whatever's happening now is the forever, right? So I think that's really good advice, and the ability to have perspective on and gratitude. I think it produces gratitude. So those are very powerful words to hear. I would say that my piece of advice for whomever you have on next has been is probably something that's become even more prominent in my work and personal life over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, as the business has had success and as we become busier. And as I would say, the advice pointing outward would be, as you have success, maybe relentlessly pursue the elimination of hurry in your life. I don't think hurry is productive. I think for some reason hurry is associated with productivity, and it's not. Like, you're not more productive just because you're hurried and stressed. And those things don't produce, I think, a clear mind, a good focus, and the ability to make decisions that can benefit your business and others. So I think we live in a culture that organically hurries everybody, despite the fact we come out with new technology every 15 minutes that's supposed to make us more productive. It just makes us more hurried. And so for me, what that looks like is I have to kind of prune away busyness and try to focus on the most important things. And it's always a game of like, okay, it builds up and then I cut it down, and then it builds up and then I cut it down. Just the nature of kind of humanity here. But I think that that's my advice, is to eliminate hurry from your life. And I think that can be very fruitful.
That's the perfect way to end this pod. Andy, obviously all of your links to your social media, to the listen, if you're not listening to the Fantasy Footballers podcast, first of all, what are you doing? Second of all,
Appreciate it.
go check them out. It's a fantastic pod. Again, as someone who's listened for the past 9 years, I've enjoyed every single minute of it, and they've helped me win a league championship. So if you're as competitive as I am in winning and bragging to your friends and saying that you've won a championship,
it's a good endorsement.
Go listen to these guys. Andy, anything that as part of the Foot Clan, anything the Foot Clan should be on the lookout for from you guys moving forward?
I think we're just going to keep trying to make the experience better, you know, in terms of we got some new features coming out. We got a new in-season app coming out. So just things to improve your experience, your companion experience with the show, and just enjoying your fantasy football season. So I think people will like what we're building out.
Love it. Andy, thanks so much for your time. And I'm sure we'll talk again real soon.
Sounds good, man. Thanks for having me.